We're looking at the power supply for my Soundtracs MX mixing console, and done some work on this power supply in terms of heat management, regulator and rectifier upgrades, recapping, that sort of thing, but we're diving back into it to address some grounding issues. Right over here, this is the back side of the power connector to building power. And first of all, here's the wire from the ground lug of that power connector, and this is at best 18 gauge wire. Pretty sure it's 18 gauge, and it is bonded to the chassis, but this is a very flimsy connector, small hardware. Paint is bared, so I mean, we got the basic right things going on there, but I just don't feel it's substantial. And then that goes over here to a ground lift switch. When the ground lift is disengaged, the input and output wire are directly strapped by the switch, and then when the ground lift switch is engaged and switched this way, then we have a 68 ohm resistor that straps this leg of the ground back to our chassis. So just not too good. And then this is the phantom power enable switch. When phantom power is disabled, the wire that goes up to the mixer carrying the 48 volt DC rail is strapped to the power supply chassis. When phantom power is engaged and the switch is moved this way, then we are strapping the 48 volt output from the power supply to the wire that goes to the interface connector and up to the mixer. So I have a question about that, because it doesn't seem to me like it would be a good idea to, although I suppose it's not going to be too much of an issue because you're not going to turn on phantom power in the mixer and have phantom power off at the power supply. But if that case did arise where you had phantom power switched off and you did have it switched in at the mixer, basically what you'd be doing is connecting your mic input pin 2 or pin 3, I can't remember, but you'd be connecting that all the way back to the power supply chassis. See, because this carries our 48 volt power up to the mixer, and if you have phantom power switched off here, then you're strapping that to ground chassis here in the power supply. Okay, so that's one issue. Our ground then, our chassis ground then goes from this phantom power switch into the harnessing and the power supply, weaves its way through up to this mass of connectors, and which these all carry our outputs from our power supply, our regulated outputs. We've got minus 17 volt here, let's see, 24 volt here, phantom power 48 volt here, and plus 17 volt here. See the little green wire? Yeah, that is the same wire from over here. It goes all the way through, and then it's strapped to the 0 volt output for the plus 17 volt rail. And then the way that these two thicker green wires go, one of them goes to 24 volt and then over to our interface connector up to the mixer, to one pin of that, and then the other green wire carries 0 volt to the minus 17 volt rail and then onto the interface connector. So it's good that they're all referenced together. The problem is that they are also referenced to the power supply chassis. So the 0 volt reference for our regulated DC power rails is referenced to the power supply chassis, and we want to keep those separate until we get up to the mixer chassis. So and then there are some other issues with this, because this pin, okay, so we've got two wires that carry our ground, and I'm going to call it ground because not only is it the chassis reference for the power supply chassis, but also our 0 volt reference for our regulated DC power rails. We've got one of those on, we've got one on one pin and we've got one on the other. The next problem is that this one, which is pin K, once you get up to the mixer, that's the only one that gets referenced to the mixer chassis. And pin J, this upper wire, that goes up to the meter bridge, does grounding for the meter bridge, so I'm not as concerned about that, but it's certainly not best practice to have that reference to the chassis all the way back at the power supply. But it also carries pin 1 for the headphone jack. So our headphone jack pin 1 reference goes all the way from the headphone jack through the mixer, through the master PCB, through the master PCB, and then through harnessing in the mixer, and all the way back through our power supply cable, and all the way back through this whole mess back to the chassis here. And yes, that means that if we engage the ground lip switch, now our headphone jack has no pin 1 reference. So those are some of the problems with the power supply that need to be addressed. We're going to remove this ground lift switch completely. I have questions about how we're referencing this 48 volt strap to the power supply chassis when phantom power is off. May or may not be an issue. And then we need to separate out our 0 volt DC power rail reference and our power supply chassis ground reference. They can't be commingled here. They need to be bonded up at the mixer. And then we've got another issue with the interface cable, which I'm not sure if these are if this is an Amphenol connector or what. There's no label on it. The cabling is nice, heavier gauge conductors, fully populated. The problem is that it's not shielded, and somehow I've got to find a way to shield the cable and have that shield reference the power supply chassis and the mixer chassis. Those two need to be bonded together, and ideally that bonding should occur over a shield in our interface cable. No shield, so I've got to try and create that shield somehow and not knowing where or how to get replacement connectors, and having attempted and been unsuccessful at depinning these connectors, I'm limited at this point to be able to just pull the connectors off of this and redo connections on a new cable that has a proper braided or foil shield inside. So that's the power supply issues.